Imagine a kingdom lost in the mists of time, and the sinister plot to keep it that way. Our Father in heaven, sitting in his timeless abode, created the past and the future for those of us who live on the earth. He made the framework and the order. The future is kept hidden, but to a special few. What kind of evil interferes with that order and hides the past as well? This story is our family's inheritance that we now wish to share with as many as possible. We are acutely aware that there is a worldwide deception underway, which desperately needs a counter. Remember, this is the time of the little season. It is the short time allowed to be governed by the father of lies.
Hey everybody, my name is Noel Joshua Hadley. That was the Book of Nicola. We brought them on. I brought them on a few weeks ago, interviewed them. It's actually our bestseller right now, so go check it out. And I'm coming to you this week from Tuscany, somewhere in the hills above Italy. You can't really see behind me because it's dark out, but we are so high up that we're typically above the clouds. I look out here all day and the clouds are below us. We are way up here. I love it. It's a beautiful area. I'm here tonight with James Graham, and we're going to be talking tonight about, we were having this discussion beforehand. We have seen this pronounced multiple different ways, whether it's Chiliasm, Chiliasm. I think there was one other in there, James. This is the oldest, what we are calling the oldest eschatology in church history. And Chiliasm, basically, it not only challenges all eschatology, it actually challenges preterism too, partial preterism, the typical fare for the Millennial Kingdom little season eschatology. So thank you, James, for being here. James, our story, I want you to tell a little bit about yourself, but our story, where you come into my life, is you contacted me, I don't know, a few months back. I'm, of course, in Tuscany now. I was in just north of Oxford then. We had an amazing phone conversation, talked 2 hours, maybe more.
Went by fast.
It went up. Yeah, eventually, it did. And I finally had to okay, sorry, James, I got to go out to the pub and get dinner or something with my family. But it was, you were sharing some mind-blowing information. And I'm thinking, I want to bring you on and talk through this. Of course, this covers our 7,000-year timeline deception that I have been covering for the last 5 years at this point, kind of looking into. And we were meeting, we were in agreement on this, just based on the fact that we're reading the same text. We're reading the Greek LXX. We're looking at this stuff. It's not rocket science, people. I mean, it just makes sense. And but you brought up some very provocative stuff that really had me thinking. So I'm going to hand it over to you. How are you doing tonight, James? Tell us about yourself. Introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, my name is James Graham, and I'm a study. I don't know. I'm a fanatic and study of the Word. I love God's Word. I love the Scriptures, and just a little bit about my past. Back in college, I got caught up in a cult for about 9 years, and I finally got out of it. Thank God. And I went through a process of going, how in the world do I discern what is true? Like because false teachers use scripture. You know what I'm saying? How do I know how I can read a scripture and know what it means and stuff? And so I went into this phase of trying to understand, how do I know this is what the text is saying? And so I started getting into history and reading history. And I realized that when I went back to the early church and I read what they had to say, they don't sound like they don't sound like Protestantism, they don't sound like Catholicism, they don't sound like Eastern Orthodox. There's something different going on here. And so I began a journey down that path. And then 2020 happened. And I remember going, okay, something's wrong. I think a lot of people started to step back and kind of re-examine things. And then came 2022. My son almost died at birth and everything. And somebody challenged me about eschatology, because up until that point, I was pretty much a preterist. I went back and forth between full preterism and just kind of partial preterism. And I started looking at Revelations again, and I was saying, you know what? There's not a lot of hope in full preterism, and I'm not tracking with what there was damage done to my hope. It was affecting my hope, really was. And I remember I was on YouTube and I stumbled across a video and it had to do with Jesus already returned or something like that. And then that caused a spiral into looking into stuff. And eventually I found your content. And I remember I got one of your books about the Millennial Kingdom, and I remember I had been reading the church fathers for a long time, and I never connected the dots with the LXX um, cosmic week, the seven ages and everything. And you brought that up, and I just light bulbs and I mean, I was like, oh yeah, oh my gosh, and this kind of, so that put me where I'm at today. That was the beginning stones of it all. So.
A quick question. I have actually quite a few questions. How did you ascertain that you were in a cult? Like, was it when they handed out the sneakers in the box and the robes? I mean, what was the moment you're like, I'm in a cult and I need to get out of this?
Oh, there was a couple of them, but I remember when I was in the thick of it, I was like, what would the apostles say about what's being taught here? Because I had a hard time sizing up what I was reading in scripture and what was being said. So that was the beginning of it. And then some of it was just friends who, I think it was just God speaking through them saying, hey, buddy, have you noticed that this is a little off about your church and stuff like that? And it was just one thing after another. And I kind of had, I'll be honest with you, I had kind of a Paul on the road to Damascus moment where the scales of my eyes kind of just fell off, and I saw it so clearly. I'll be honest with you. To answer your question, no, it was by the grace of God that I got out of that. I mean, I know I wasn't smart enough, but there was a lot of different things. But I look back at it, and God just pulled me out of that.
So yeah, I mean, I've had a few of those scale coming out of my eyes moments as well. All right, so that, I mean, the next question is regarding eschatology. That you came out of, for years you were a preterist, a full or partial preterist, kind of bouncing around. I'm sure that happens with a lot of preterists going back and
Oh yeah,
forth. So it's kind of like that in Calvinism, where it's like, what are you, a 1 or a 5, and you kind of bounce. Today I feel like a
right.
5, and yesterday I felt like a 3. But the thing is, I mean, the churches I grew up in, eschatology was very Zionist centric, very Israel based. Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye, that kind of stuff. 1948, 19, was it 60? Was it 67? And I knew about the preterists, but they were always the kind of I don't know if they were the cool kids. It was almost like the weird scholarly kids kind of in the corner.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, like, what was it that, I mean, what caused you to fall into that all those years ago? I'm just curious because
Yeah,
I,
you know,
I've met very few people who were, people are becoming preterists through this little season, Millennial Kingdom research, but I've met very few beforehand.
Yeah, I pretty much, so my background, the church I grew up with, most of them were a form of preterism. We're all millennial, kind of a mix in there too, usually. But what got me get into it is I remember I was watching some sort of documentary about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and I remember being exposed to that. And my father, this was in high school, he was reading an article about the siege, and there was a statement in there, and it said that the blood records of the Levitical priests were destroyed in that siege, and so they didn't know how to do the sacrificial system anymore. And I realized, wow, so that kind of made clear that Yeshua, the Messiah, was the way then. And so that's where I really got into it and started studying it, and really big on Matthew 24 and all those type of things. And whenever I had friends who were premillennial and they were talking about the rapture and everything, I just kind of rolled my eyes because the text that they were using, I was like, That's not what it's saying." And so because of that, and my dad is a very scholarly person. He's been hired. He used to be hired by companies to do research and all stuff. So I was the kid. I would say, "Hey, Dad, what does this word mean?" And he would point over at the dictionary, encyclopedia, and he says, "The answer's over there." So from the very beginning, he taught me how to research. So when people brought up stuff, I just I wouldn't buy it, and I would actually usually challenge them. Are you sure that that text is saying what you were saying? So I never got caught up in futurism or the premillennial persuasion that we see all the time.
And you grew up in the church, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All
Hmm.
right. I mean, I just, I mean, I I grew up in, like, rapture circles my whole life. So I guess we were just like in completely different circles where we went to our Sunday morning church.
Right.
So, all right. So I think most people out there listening knows what preterism or partial or full preterism is. Maybe some don't, but that's kind of common fare now for little season research. So I want you to take us through Chiliasm, or
Yeah.
what are you going with? Are you going with how
Yeah.
are you pronouncing this? How did
I
we
don't know.
decide we were
I got rebuked by somebody who, because the Eastern Orthodoxy, if you, especially if you talk to like a historian, they refer to this as heresy, and they refer to it as heresy for two reasons. One, it's too Jewish. They'll say that it's too Jewish, and then the second one is it promotes that the idea that it's okay to enjoy the pleasures of a perfect world. The early church was real big on that. You know, you could enjoy the garden as was intended with the Lord and enjoy food and all that kind of stuff. And so Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism, because of Manichaeism and other beliefs that caught in, they really had a hard time of anyone enjoying their flesh. They thought that was this evil. So
well?
that was part of the thinking, especially in the writings of Papias, about this idea of actually enjoying a perfect world physically and also a spiritual position. So they wrote that off as heresy in those
Well,
groups.
and the funny thing about Papias or
Mhm.
Papias
Yeah,
is that the quotes we have from him, we know he wrote like a 5-volume book or something like that.
yeah,
But the quotes we have of him, what you just mentioned, where he's talking about the grapes and the wine in the Little Kingdom, we only have that because he was being mocked. I think it was
yes.
Tertullian who was actually he was with Constantine, and he was actually mocking him for what he was saying. That's the only
But
reason we
it was
have it.
Eusebius was my, he called him an imbecile.
Oh, Eusebius.
Um,
Yeah. And I knew it was one of those guys.
mm,
Okay, so take us through this, and I will point out too. You said that it's like heresy because it's too Jewish, and in my mind,
mm,
I did a video on this probably a couple years ago now on the Nazarene, and in my mind, it was in my research of the Nazarene where I kept seeing this coming up and seeing that this was a Nazarene belief, this idea that there would be a millennial kingdom, 1,000 years of rest on the earth. And so I always find this kind of ironic, a little sad. I will point at this out just for the elephant in the room that
yeah,
for many of the people in this movement who are pushing that there was a millennial kingdom, that they stole it from us and they took it from us. Many of them, I would say the bulk of them, are not interested in keeping the Sabbath
mhm.
on the basis that it is Jewish. But they need to understand the irony here. Of course, the fact they're advocating 1,000 years of Sabbath rest,
Right,
um, but meaning that the law could not have been done away with before the millennial
right,
kingdom, that it was still in place. So it has to still be in place because we have feast days and things like that, like the eighth great day. But that being
that's
said,
right.
it's a Jewish idea. The idea of the
Yep,
millennial kingdom is a Jewish idea. It is a Nazarene idea. And as we're
that's
going to
right.
see tonight, that the church was very much against it. So it
Oh
was not a
yes,
popular idea. So say,
no.
with no further ado, take us through it. What is uh, Chiliasm and what does it mean?
Well, is a lot of your audience into the millennial kingdom? Are they, do they believe in the millennial kingdom being past tense and it was 1,000 years? Would you say by and large?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, you had told me that you've been following this channel for like several years
Yeah.
now. So you've seen the sheer amount of stuff I put out there on it over the last 5-6 years. So I would say there might be some who follow out of curiosity. They're like, yeah, I don't
Okay.
know, or just as kind of interested. Yeah, I think everyone by this point, pretty much, anyone's watching this video is going to be on at least on board with the
Well,
idea or investigating it. So
so what I would say is this: is that what I see a lot in the movement of the millennial kingdom or little seasonists, or there's different names going around, is they're trying to use preterism and a mixture. I even see some premillennial modern stuff seeping in, just trying to understand this where we are in eschatology, and they really don't need to do that. You just need to go and study Chiliasm, because the earliest eschatology of the church, which is Jewish, it came from the Jews. Um, Tells us exactly where we are in eschatology. In fact, I would even venture to say that no, if you were to get into a time machine and go back to the days of Papias or Barnabas or whatever, and tell them what year you're in and that there's still sin, the only thing they would conclude is, oh, you must be in the release of Satan. Their frame of thinking would allow them to assess that. Now, they may be a little surprised by how long it's gone, but we'll get into that later. But we also
Yep.
don't know. But their eschatology would realize, oh, you guys are past the millennial kingdom. That would be their first initial thought. If you're using the LXX timing and you say we're from around the year 7,500, then they would say, okay, you're post millennial kingdom, and death and suffering is still around. So you're in the release of the devil. So that's important to understand. What we're talking about is that there's already a framework of understanding things, and it's not new. It's old. In fact, a lot of the naysayers in the millennial kingdom say that this is a new idea. It's not a new idea. It is actually, in my opinion, the oldest idea. As you were pointing out, the idea is Jewish. It's Jewish, right? So what is Chiliasm? And the more I looked into this, and I even see people all the time on YouTube, they'll go to the same people we're going to look at tonight and try to impose their modern premillennial views or preterist views and try to make them say what they want them to say. And what I've tried to do, and maybe it's because I was in the cult and everything, I want to make sure that I understand it the way they understand it. And so I've been really working hard to try to understand it. But essentially, this is what Chiliasm is, okay? One, it divides all of man's history into 7 or 8 millennial periods based on Genesis 1 and 2, okay? And Barnabas, and correct me if I'm wrong, is about the only one that I know that actually speaks of the eighth age. Most of them talk about the first 6,000 years, and then they'll talk about the millennial kingdom as a separate time period. And there's a reason for that, and I'll get into that for a moment. But another aspect of Chiliasm is they believe that the days of creation and the description of paradise in Genesis is prophecy of Messiah and the saints. And I put references in all this so you can go see that. And this is where it gets really interesting. They believe that after 6,000 years, which would be around 500 AD, there will be a literal 1,000-year reign of the first resurrected saints who were martyred and persecuted under the fourth beast, Rome. And you can check that out in Hypothesis of Rome's commentary on Daniel. They believe that the saints would take the place of God's heavenly council, who ruled the nations before Messiah took the throne. And I was shocked. That's actually in the writings of Papias. He talks about, there's fragments in there about understanding that the angels oversaw the nations. And we'll get into that later, why that's so important. And then the saints would take that position at the millennial kingdom. And that's a conversation of itself. But they understood this, but they knew the saints hadn't take that position until the fall of the beast. So, but they
I
knew it
want
was coming.
I want to stop here on a couple points just to
Yeah.
help clarify some things that. So, because when we were talking earlier this summer about this, and
Mm.
we were both on board with the idea of what I call the 7,000-year timeline deception. The idea that there are 6,000 years of history from Adam going to the beginning of the millennial kingdom, and there's 1,000 years, and then we are
Yeah.
after that there, and that we can see according to Greek LXX timeline and the books that are associated with it, that Messiah came around the year 5,500, which
Yes.
gives us 500 more years leading up to amazingly 536. It goes right up there, which is 500
Exactly.
years after Messiah.
Mhm.
Close but no cigar. I mean, if we put him around around 30 AD, whatever, it's so
Yeah.
close. It's unbelievable. Well, maybe
It's
you can
something.
even fudge with those 6 years if you
It's
want a little bit.
amazing. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, who's to say it wasn't exactly 500 years? And there's, people come to me all the time. They're like, "Noel, why do you believe this?" And these are like millennial kingdom people, because you're
Yeah.
supposed to like happen right away. And 70 AD. We're gonna be talking about 70 AD tonight and why that may be chasing a phantom a little bit. Like it, I know you're not as convinced about it as you used to be.
No.
I tell people, look, I can only go according to these texts that I have. There's all these texts in front of
Right.
us, and they all are saying they're building the same picture. And as you're going to be pointing out tonight, and as I pointed out, there are actual, like, if you want to call them theologians, church fathers, who would say things like he's not coming for another 200 years, because
That's
they
right.
knew where they
That's
were on
right.
the timeline. They knew, hey,
Yes.
we're like in the year 5,800. We got like 200 years more to go before Rome falls, and they predicted it. They
Yes.
accurately predicted when Rome would fall. So a lot of
To
people are
the
saying,
T.
yeah, Yeah, and a lot of people are saying, well, no, like, history, it's all made up, and they move things around. So, like, I'm sure that that's possible to do that. But the thing the thing is that, yeah, we've got these actual texts that are saying that. So, okay. And the second point I want to just make clear here that you mentioned right here, this is I don't know even how you read this, James, when you
Okay.
talk about how the saints would take the place of God's heavenly council, basically take the place of the 70, which I
Yes.
believe they were the 70 were judged. According
Yes.
to, if we take the Dead Sea book, the book of the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness, it makes it very clear that the 70 would be judged at that time, and that the saints would replace them. And I think this is prophesied when Yahshua sent out the apostles, the 70, to the
Yes.
nations. But
That's right.
the thing is, and I'm curious on your thoughts on this, because this is where I do see two potential, like a divergence in history. I see two potential realities. One is where the saints were physically ruling on the earth, and I could point out texts that
Yep.
seems to say that.
Right.
But then I could also show where they were spiritually, this is kind of more preterist territory, but they were spiritually ruling just as the 70 were, right? So you have them,
Mhm.
you see that in Revelation where they've got the thrones up there and they're
Yep.
ruling over the earth. And I would be curious, you don't have to answer that now, or we could get to it later, where you're at on that, because
Yeah.
I'm more of the persuasion now that they were spiritually ruling over the earth. And Yasha was like, hey, look, Donald Trump saw, hey, I fired all these 70 others. They're fired. They're
Mhm.
done. You guys want the job? Good luck with this, because I'm telling you right now, like, you saw how difficult it was for Moses. So now you guys get the job, and you're going to find
Mhm.
how obstinate people can truly be.
Yeah, so where I kind of land, and after looking at Chiliasm and why it went away and all this type of stuff, so there was a strong push because of what happened with Rome. Rome was very pagan, paganism mixed with the church, and we'll get into that later. But Manichaeism came in, and it was a form of the Gnostic branch that separated the spiritual and the physical. And this always most Christian debates, it's like it's this, and it's like no, it's that, and the actual answer is actually this. It's a both. When it comes to the saints, if you actually look at the storylines, I mean, there's countless numbers of stories of the saints appearing during the medieval age, and they
Yep.
vary from this: visions, dreams, and then they physically showed up. Okay, so it's all of it. They could physically manifest and they could physically walk around. They could also go to places that we can't imagine, you know? So I would say both. I wouldn't say one or the other
Yeah,
personally.
I haven't discounted either option either. Though the one thing that I've covered the least on, though I have suggested the
Mhm,
most, is just what I have. I mean, just going across Europe this year, and it's overwhelming to
mhm,
all the cathedrals and castles and places I've been, where you get this overwhelming sense of the hypersensitive spirituality that they had during the Middle Ages, the early and late Middle Ages, and how common it was for people to say
right.
they saw such and such saint that came and visited them in some sort of vision. So it seemed to, I
Yeah.
mean, how often does that happen today, where you're like, yeah, Peter came and visited me last night? It's
It's
like,
not very
yeah,
often.
yeah, it doesn't happen.
Well, and then I had a friend who was considering Eastern Orthodoxy, and he was looking at this for a while. In fact, this helped him stay away from getting into that. But he asked one of the priests there, how is it that the saints are running around doing stuff, and yet the bones of Saint Peter are over there? you know, and they have this weird doctrine of spiritual ascent and everything. I just don't think that's St. Peter's bones. Personally, I just don't. But they don't have a good answer. They don't say, well, there was a first resurrection and blah blah blah. They don't have that answer, you know. And so Killism does. Killism tells you why it's happening and all this kind of stuff. And so I find that very fascinating. I'm interested to see what you come back from Europe with, and after thinking and praying over it, some of the stuff that you find about it. But where you're at right now, you're saturated with stories of saints everywhere, as you pointed out. And it's kind of
Um,
like the UFO phenomenon. There's thousands and thousands of sightings. There's thousands and thousands of sightings of the saints during the medieval period, defeating enemies at battle. I mean, all sorts of. It almost sounds like Lord of the Rings sometimes. Like Gandalf and the two towers showing up, and it's like what do you do that? You just take them all and just throw them out the window? Or you ask the question, why are the saints around? Well, Chiliasm answers that because they were anticipating a 1,000-year period where the saints would rule. And that's what you find in that time period.
All right. Well, I could I could talk more about the bone situation. But I'm actually going to the underground, the catacombs next week in Rome. I'll be looking at that. Of course, they've moved
Cool.
they've moved, quote, bunny ear quotes. They've moved all the bones. So you can't see them anymore. There are, I guess, museums you can go and you can see like some of the monks and stuff. But I've looked into a lot this year, and I've seen a lot of weird things, and I've seen a lot of not weird things, and I could go both ways on that. I could go on like, they really were physically, literally resurrected. I've been very open on this on my channel, to that there was a resurrection that was actually completely separate from the bones. Meaning that the bones would still be left behind. So
Right.
we're looking at a lot of the same text, right? And I'm,
Yep.
anyways, I could go both ways. So,
Yeah.
but let's keep looking. Let's keep digging into this.
Yeah. One of the things I really want to talk about is how they understand time. This is really fascinating. In fact, this is the arguments that preterism has against Chiliasm. And so if you could go over to the next slide, I really want people to see this because this blows your really kind of a lot of the way you read Revelations. But um, it says understanding time in Chiliasm. There are two types of days. There's a 24-hour and a 1,000-year one. And I put Genesis 2:17 and Psalms 94. And the idea is that when you go to Genesis chapter 2, God tells, upon the day that you eat of this fruit, you shall surely die. And when you go over to Psalms 90, it quotes when God says that you dust, you shall return to the earth and everything. And it says, as a day, or as yesterday is as 1,000 years to God. The Jews noticed that Adam died at the year 930, which happens to be 70 years short of 1,000. So it was reasonable to say, well, God does not lie. And most theologians today will say, well, he died spiritually the day that he ate of the fruit. And there again, that's the physical and spiritual being separate, right? But a Jew would say, no, no, no. Well, that he may have been corrupted when he did that with sin, but he didn't die until he was 930. That's pretty clear. So that was where they got the idea that a day to God must be 1,000 years. This is like a fundamental. And then you have Peter affirm that in 2 Peter 3. And he says, do not overlook. And what does he say? This fact. Why does he say don't overlook this fact? Because this is a fundamental understanding of God's timing. God's time is different than ours. And this is the bedrock of Chiliasm, right? So the next one is each day that God spoke. This is where it gets really fascinating. He has also spoken prophecy of the events of each corresponding millennium. And that blew me away the more I studied this. But when you look at the early church fathers, you know how the misuse of the passage in the Sermon on the Mount is, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And then you go to Luke's account, the walk to Emmaus, where he told him how the scriptures talked about him. The early church knows how to go to a text and say, look, Messiah is there. Do you see Messiah? No, I don't. Well, let me show you. And the way they saw him is supernatural. It was there all along, and then they couldn't see it until afterwards, right? And this is true also with the Genesis narrative. There was epiphanies, and you can see this happening. We'll get into this later with even Paul's writings and John's writings. They seem to understand a correlation of things, and you see it naturally when you understand that. But the third point is each millennium is divided. Now, this is interesting into two 500-year age periods. And Second Esdras is really fascinating because it says that there's 12 ages, and it says you're in the 10th, and you're already past the halfway point of it. And if you look at when Second Esdras is supposedly written, is during the Babylon occupation. So this is more than 500 years before Christ. So 2 ages left is the 500 years leading to Jesus, and then Jesus to the fall of Rome. Okay, why? Because the 12 periods of time is 6,000 years under the fall of man, from Adam to the destruction of the beast, is a 6,000 years of history. A new history begins when the saints are resurrected. That is a new history. The sons
James,
of Adam are now back.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I hope that everyone heard that James, like you just spoke with the most clarity. Maybe other people on other channels are like saying this every week and I'm missing it, but that was the most clear, concise. Like that was incredible. Like the idea in second address of the 500-year ages, I
Yes.
completely missed that myself. So that was the first that I put that together. And I've been
Well,
trying to think about this calendar for several years now. So that's because I know he talks about that where he's like in the the 10th or something. Like what? Like what does that
yeah,
mean?
yeah,
So that
500-year periods. Well,
yeah.
you helped me out. No, I want to throw this back at you. You pointed out the prophecy of the phoenix with First Clement.
Mm.
And I realized, well, I was like, wow, I said, are the millenniums divided up in 500-year periods? And then I went back to Genesis 1. Each day there is evening and then what? The morning. So a day has two divisions. And then when I found this passage in second Esdras, I was like, it's 500-year periods. It makes perfect. The cycle of the phoenix is what we're seeing. And perhaps, and while this is not clearly mentioned, in fact, if you go to the next section here after the second Esdras, it says, while never directly taught by the early church, the two periods per millennium could be seen as an evening and day cycle, like each day in Genesis. Now this is where it gets profound. When Messiah came at 5,500, if the first 500 was night and the second 500 is day, he came at the dawn of the age. Let's sit on that for a moment. So if there's a cycle there, it's poetic. That it's not just a random choice. He came on the sixth day at the dawn of the age. And that's like, oh my gosh, that's prophecy in real time. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, so that's how they look at time. And so when you're looking at Revelations and Jesus says, I'm coming soon, what kind of soon? A 24 hours soon, or a 500 years soon, or when it says the little season, is that he'll be released for a little while? Is that less than a day? Whose day? Is it God's day? Less than 1,000? So Chiliasm takes that into account when they're reading prophecy and scripture, on asking the simple question, which I wish more preterists would ask this question: whose time frame are you talking about? Are you talking about God's time frame or yours? Because they'll try to say, well, it happened 40 years later, so that's soon. Well, no, it's not. That's not soon either. That's not. So if you're 70 AD, 40 years being soon to you is the Greek word there. No, unless you're using two types of time, our time or God's time. And God's time actually is pretty worked out in scripture. So when I read Peter saying that in the last days, he's talking about in the last couple thousands of years or the last couple of millenniums. And that makes a lot of sense. And that's obviously, he doesn't mean days, like 72 hours or something like that. So you have to be really careful when you're reading prophecy. And I believe Chiliasm has the best understanding and breakdown of God's timing. And when you read the scriptures, they make sense when you look at this framework. So, anyways, I just want to throw it out there. But if you could turn, this is the one that I really want
And I
everyone to
hope
see.
Well, yeah, and I hope that because we have spoken about this, and I told you
Yeah.
that the one hang up I still have, even though you were the first one to really start making me rethink some of this about 70 AD. But the one thing I'm still really hung up on is I know you just said that 40 years is not soon, but um it's just this idea that it seemed like the promise was for their generation. And now we probably don't have time for that tonight. And maybe you could break that down and, show, well, maybe it wasn't, but just when I read from Matthew through the epistles, it seems even Paul, it just seems like this idea that like they're the generation is going to happen to. Just throwing that out there. But I'm definitely, you were the one who really got me, thinking about, well, maybe 70 AD is not the mile marker we should be looking for. So,
Well, so here's the
um,
thing. I don't deny the temple was destroyed. What I question is the weight of what that means. And also,
right, exactly.
yeah. And here's the thing. Uh, when you look at this conversation, and the most common thing, and I was a predator, so this is what I would do. All right, James. He says this generation in Matthew 24. Okay, deal with that. Okay. Well, I'm not denying that the temple wasn't destroyed afterwards, but also take into account this: the word generation. If you look at how the sibling oracles uses it, it can actually be used in terms of an age. Okay.
Hmm. Yeah.
Also, if you look at, and I got different books and everything, um, it's the Panera of, it was Salamis or whatever, but it talks about all the different heresies. And as I point out later on in the slides, Judaism didn't go away after 70 AD. Okay. Uh, a lot of
The
preterists act
Talmud,
like,
only, well, yeah, the Talmud strengthened and the
right.
Kabbalah. So, but
Yeah.
here, okay. So I'll just go ahead and say it. And we were talking on the phone, and you had brought up about, well, if Messiah, you're coming from like a former preterist, right? So you're
Right.
coming from this perspective, and you're really questioning
Yeah.
this worldview that a lot of us have been embracing, and now you're kind of coming out of it, even though you are of the millennial kingdom persuasion, little season, and you're like, well, okay, if he appeared, if the glorious appearing happened in say 66 AD, in 66 to 70 AD, in that time frame, why are none of the church fathers talking about this?
Right.
And this is something that is brought up a lot against preterism. And I had a quick
Yes.
response. To it, and I was like, well, it actually makes sense that it was the people in the context of a glorious appearing over Jerusalem. It was the people who were there would have seen it, but obviously, if I were in Timbuktu or Rome or some other place, I would not have seen it, right? But
Right.
however, something you said though that really got me thinking is you're like, well, I don't even think you even asked the question. It was just in your dialogue, and I was like, whoa, wait a second here. And you were talking about how none of the church fathers ever talked about the destruction of the temple. And it wasn't until when was the first one that you saw? Was it Constantine era? Like, was it
Yeah.
Eusebius? Yeah, he was the first one. And so you've got, like, according to the official timeline, you've got like 300 years where no Christian theologian is talking whatsoever about the destruction of the temple.
Yep.
And this is supposed to be a huge event. This is a
Right.
earth-shattering event. And by the way, this throws out the whole idea of, oh, thank God the temple was destroyed, the law was done away with.
Exactly.
The early Christians should be screaming from the rooftop, hallelujah, the law is done away with, right? They're not
Exactly.
doing
That
it.
should be the greatest theological point in the writings, and it's not there.
Yeah. So that really got me thinking, like, like maybe we are chasing a phantom in 70 AD. And
It's
I don't have the
misdirection.
answers. I don't have the answers, but it's definitely something I have put on the shelf, and I'm thinking through. But maybe you have some more thoughts on that. I just want to throw that out there. So let's get into the. You want to talk about the chronology of the
Yeah, well,
cosmic?
we'll get to 70 AD later because that's. And first of all, I just want to say that I'm still trying to figure that one out, but I have some good thoughts about it that it's getting me in a good direction. But we'll get into that a little further because there's a context we need to set up to go further into it. But yeah, if you can scroll down. So this blew me away. This sold me when I saw this. Okay, um, is that you have the 24-hour periods or the day periods, and by and large, what I can tell, the church fathers believed that the days were 24-hour, but they really believed that it represented a 6,000 period of human history. And I know there's disagreements on that, but the apostolic fathers and stuff, they seem to account that for an actual day that I've been able to find when they're talking about. But what's more fascinating to me is what happens on each day. And then when you use LXX dating and chronology, there's some coincidental, convenient alignments with the dates that occur in that age with what actually occurred on the 24-hour period. One of the most obvious ones is on the first day, God separates the light and darkness. On the first millennium, Adam sins and creates two kingdoms on the earth. You had the kingdom of light and you had the kingdom of darkness. So those two kingdoms are formed in the first millennium. And John, in the Gospel of John, is speaking out of the first day and talking about light and darkness. He understands this. He sees the correlation of day one creation and the two kingdoms.
Hmm.
Okay, that's not a coincidence. I
Sons of
just I
Seth,
just don't think so.
sons of Seth, sons of Cain is a great example of that as well.
Right, and exactly. And then you have day two where God sets in the boundaries of heaven and earth, and then you have the angels violating the boundaries of heaven and earth, as stated in Jude. They abandoned their abode. You had the violation of what God set up in the second day. The angels violated on day two. And then this is the fascinating one. And I know you've mentioned you have a different interpretation in previous videos, but I was looking at how the early church used it. But Second Peter, he correlates day three where God pulls the land out of the water, and he correlates it to the third age when God floods the earth. And you don't see that unless you're using LXX, but you realize Peter saw a connection with day three and age three, which you have the flood. And so he pulls the land out of the water in day three, and then in the
Yeah,
third age, he puts the land back in the water.
yeah, I think in the Greek LXX, the flood is like in the year like 2200 or something like that.
Hmm.
But then in the I don't think we have the timeline in front of us. But then in the Masoretic, it's like 1600 or something like that.
Yeah, it's in the
there,
second age. Yeah.
yeah, so there's like a 500-600 year difference
Yeah.
between the two on that. Yeah,
Yeah, and so you don't see these parallels unless you're using the right chronology, which is the Septuagint, the LXX. If you're using Masoretic, you don't see that the third day of creation also is correlated to the great flood of Noah on the third age. You can't see that. You can't see that. And then the fourth one is interesting because you have God. He puts the lights in the heavens and the governing of the day and the night. And then look what happens in the story of Abraham and Joseph. He's
mm.
prophesying that they will reign, that they will be the future saints and everything. And that promise is given to Abraham in the fourth age. Well, bing, ding, ding, ding. I mean, is that a coincidence or is that prophecy?
And
You know what I'm
again,
saying?
that's only Greek LXX too, because the Masoretic we would
Exactly.
still Abraham would now be in the third age, so we're like a whole age behind on the Masoretic.
Exactly.
Yeah,
About 1,500 years. And then day five is fast. Okay, so this one in day five and day six, the Torah, which is known as the five books, is given in the fifth age. That alone is fascinating to me, you know. But the birds and the animals of the sea and the beasts of the land and the next day. Have you noticed that empires are usually they have an animal that shows that empire? So for the Egyptians, it was the falcon. Okay, they were under dominance of the falcon in Egypt, which is I think it's Ra's symbol, I think. And
yeah.
so and in certain and you had a lot of that, okay? And then in the sixth age, the beast appear. Well, right before the beginning of the sixth age, you have the empires. You have Babylon and Persia start to come in. But most of the sixth age, Israel is under the oppression and dominance of the beast. So I really believe the animals here are representing ruling nations or empires. And empires is more of a beast. The nations are more represented by animals. So I think this is symbolic, but it makes so much sense. Why did God show Daniel the empires through the beast? Why use that language? You're being dominated by a beast. I made you to rule over the beast, but you're being dominated by a beast, the empire. It makes perfect sense when you look at the language of dominion. So in that
James,
text, he's foretelling.
James, you're the first person I think I've ever heard say that before. The correlation between we should be ruling over the beast, but the beasts are ruling over us. Sixth day. That's really really good.
Yeah, and so and the more I look into this, it's so profound. I when you lay, and I'll come back to the 6 8 in just a moment because that's the one that just blows my mind more than anything. But um, all the fundamental doctrines of what God wants for us are pretty much established not only in the 7 day narrative, but also in the prophecy of the seven ages. And you see that especially in the with Yeshua's ministry and the apostles. I really believe they understood this. I really do. In fact, if you look at day six, this is where it gets mind blowing. It's when he makes Adam and Eve. In the sixth age, as you pointed out earlier, Jesus, according to Chiliasm, came in the year 5500, and he died for his congregation, for that, so that they might have the opportunity to rule with him. Right. That is a symbology of Eve, and Paul gets this in Ephesians chapter 5 when he's talking about marriage. He talks about the great mystery revealed, and he's correlating marriage to Christ and the assembly. And if you have the King James, he quotes bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. So he understands Adam and Eve is correlated to Christ and the assembly, Okay. And then not only that, just as God made Adam on the sixth day, God brings the second Adam in the sixth age. And Paul makes that point twice. He makes that in Romans, and he also makes that in First Corinthians chapter 15. So if you look at how they're using Old Testament, the core message of the early church is in Genesis chapter 1. It's just hidden because Jesus hadn't come yet. The Messiah hadn't come. Yeshua hadn't died on the cross, and then given the insight through the spirit of what this stuff means. But it's hidden in plain sight. It's right there. And when you see it, you understand where they're coming from when they write about it.
Yeah, this is amazing because I'm getting ready to start my Torah portions again tomorrow. Most people, I think, probably won't start Torah portions for another 2 weeks. And of course, I took a year off. And what I started to do this last year, because I get really frustrated in the first Torah portion, Genesis 1-6. My promise, my oath this year is that I won't, because I spent the last year just dissecting it. I started going through and being like, okay, I'm just going to take my time in Genesis 1-6, and I took most of a year to do it. A lot of people lost track that I was still doing it. I was still doing it up till almost to the end. In fact, like 3 weeks ago, I just gave one on Leviathan, but
Yeah.
I'd given the Genesis 1-6 challenge and shown how the rabbis will talk about this, that basically the doctrine that you can see, the themes you could see being developed in all scripture is found there.
Yep.
And it's amazing how many just layers upon layers upon layers there are, just as what you've shown right here, where I think you use the phrase hidden in plain sight. Absolutely.
Hidden in plain sight. Once you
Yeah.
see it, you can't unsee it, Noel. It's just there, and it's law. In fact, Paul, I know there's people who like Paul and hate Paul. I think Paul's really misunderstood. When you read 1 Corinthians 13, he says, according to the law, a woman should remain silent. What law are you talking about, Paul? He's talking about the order of creation. He's speaking out of Genesis 2 and 3 is what he's doing, because he discerns the will through the law. So Paul doesn't believe you get away with the law or throw it out. He uses the law in order to point to Messiah all the time. So there's a disconnect in understanding what Paul's doing, and I see that all the time.
One of my New Year's I guess O's or whatever is to stop apologizing when I quote from Paul.
Yeah.
And I've grown to, I went from, being an anti-Pauler to loving Paul
Mhm.
to death. I really do. And I'm not going to go on the apology tour anymore. I know it's a little off topic, but I will give this story really quickly because I always laugh. My buddy Dave. So Dave, he helped me start the unexpected cosmology based
Mm.
on both of our disdain for Paul. And I was
Okay.
putting out these papers on Paul, and he's like, dude, this is so good. We got to get this out to the world. We got to tell people. And I never really did. I was never really big on getting Paul out. But the day, it was right when my daughter was born back in 2022. And he got word that I was going kind of, he called it, flip-flop. I was flip-flopping and going back pro Paul. And I still had a lot of questions, but he was so angry at me, and I thought our friendship was going to be over. But amazingly, he is like more pro Paul than I am now. And he's like,
Mm.
he gets on fire. Like he's like, Paul is awesome. And he just like was arguing Torah all the time. And so I'm always
Yeah.
laughing now because, he was like, it's kind of funny. So,
What's so interesting about Paul is that the reason why all they're doing, and you see this with the apostles and the church, is they use the Torah, they use the law to point to Messiah. That's what they're doing.
yeah.
That's what they're doing. So whenever Paul gets upset at the Jews or incorporating certain things, it's because they're not pointing to the glory of God. That's what the big tension is that he's trying to communicate. But I didn't know that about you. That's really fascinating. So you started off one way, and then now you're like,
Well, so what happens is that when you one of the drive coming over to Camp Torah can be really dangerous because one of the driving things that brings a lot of people to the Torah is zealousness, and zealousness
mm,
is good, like the zealousness of Phinehas, the zealousness of Elijah, right? But what happens is that zealousness without knowledge can lead into a lot of destructive areas. And so people come over, and there's all these in the truther realm, you have all these, back alley, red pill dealers, and they're like popping out of trash cans. Hey kid, you want to get woke? They got everything there for you. And it's I have watched in my career, and I will continue doing so, and some unfortunately loved ones basically research themselves into retardation, where you go down this path of just, you basically like disprove the Bible or disprove the Old Testament or the New Testament, or and they always have the same. Oh, I'm just searching truth, that kind of stuff. I'm just a truth seeker, but and so what happens is you come over to the Torah and you're really zealous, and there's all these special interest groups over there, like, oh, you think you're celebrating Sabbath? Well, let me tell you about my calendar, and this kind of stuff. And, you go down those paths. So Paul is an easy one, because a lot of people, you have all this, you have all your church friends and your family saying, but, they're throwing Paul at you all the time. And he's easy to throw out, because you're like, well, he must be apostate then, right? You're saying that because you can't, it's tiresome having to try to defend Paul all the time. And it's easier just to say, well, I guess he doesn't pass the Deuteronomy 13 test, right? So anyways, my advice to everybody when they come over to the Torah and they're zealous and they're passionate is if you don't get Paul, it's okay just to put him on the shelf for a couple of years. And even if you're starting to question Paul, before you become that keyboard warrior that, you're going to die on that hill, you're just going to go out there and what's the next thing, and that you're just going to die on that hill. You know what? Just give it a couple of years. Just give it a couple of years and think through it. That's what I tell everybody. And I, like I said, I love Paul now. I really do. That guy was a warrior. He was out there. Like he was, well, some people won't like this, but he was trolling the Pharisees. I mean, the guy was, anyways, we're going off topic, but let's keep...
Well, but back to Paul, when you understand Chiliasm, you understand a lot of stuff, like fundamentally when you get it. I mean, I really believe the apostles understood a lot of the stuff we're talking about this evening. In fact, whenever they're writing the epistles, they assume their audience. Even Catholic and Eastern Orthodoxy will point out it's heretical because it's too Jewish. What does that mean? It probably means that the apostles understood it, actually.
Yeah.
If it's Jewish, that means they knew about the things we're talking about tonight. They weren't unaware of it. The animals representing empires and stuff like that. They understood the language of Daniel. They understood the language of Daniel is connected to the dominance issue of creation and where we're at right now. That wasn't hard for a Jew to grasp that, but to fully understand what's going on, with Christ will come later.
And speaking of the Jewishness of it, this is the elephant in the room, the Masoretic, right? At some point in history, they changed the timeline, and to actually, we'll say it right, to cover up the millennial kingdom, to cover up what happened, and to make it out like it hasn't happened yet, so we can get their version of what their Edenic vision that they want through Zionism, through whatever dispensational thinking, whatever it is. So
and it's there's a big academic term. It's called chronomessianism, and I think they were either way. Either they were trying to cover up the millennial kingdom, or they were trying to cover up the fact that Jesus came in the 6th age, because that's a hard one to deal with. Okay, I mean, just is, but it's probably both. It's probably both. But the idea that he came at year 5,500 at the dawn of the 6th age, that kind of means that he is Messiah. You have to deal with that. So but anyways, if you go scroll down, I spent a lot of time trying to get LXX dating and then the chronology, and I'm going to point this out for some people who are you said this in one of your past videos, that ice rings don't lie, that if you look at the dating of the 536 cataclysm based off ice rings, it was that long ago. You have to deal with that, and that's one reason why I actually think we're roughly around 7,500 years, is because of the cataclysm research that's just starting. In fact, this is real interesting, Noel. I don't want to go on a 536 AD tangent with the cataclysm, but that stuff started to appear in the 1980s. I remember watching some stuff on the History Channel back when it was the History Channel, and they were talking about it looks like maybe there was a comet or some volcanic activity that caused the plagues and famines and stuff. And I remember I went to my high school teacher and I said, "Is it possible that a cataclysm caused the Dark Ages?" He says, "No, that's ridiculous." That's what he said. And then you had all these researchers who are like climate change people. They did all this research and data in the last decade, and they basically discovered the worst year in history with what they discovered. And that wasn't them trying to prove anything that would help us out in the research of the LXX calendar. They're trying to prove climate change, and they ended up uncovering one of the most important finds, in my opinion, that helps us understand where we might actually be in the timeline,
In fact,
and what happened to cause it.
In fact, some genealogists that I've spoken to have also stated that it appears that there was a mass extinction event where almost all genealogies can be traced back to very few people 1,500 years ago. So there was, and so just again to point this out to everybody, this timeline that you and I are talking about, it just, for me, I don't know why it doesn't make sense to other people. For me, it makes the most sense biblically, all the texts we have, even the scientific evidence. To say that the millennial kingdom ended, like some people will say 100, 200 years ago. I'm like, okay, but then like you're looking at the tree ring issue. You've got, it's 1,500 years ago. Like you could trace this back to the year 536 when this happened. So, and so, yeah, anyways, you've got that. So I am of the opinion, because a lot of people are like, no, like there's like 700 years or 1,000 years of missing time, all this kind of stuff. That's one of the things I went across Europe. I went to a lot of cemeteries this year, and I looked at a lot of dates. I found a lot of anomalies, like the fact that nobody is buried in the Middle Ages at all. They tell us there are these mass graves under the ground, but nobody was being buried in tombs. Nobody cared to do that. It wasn't until the 1500s when all these graves started appearing. Mass, 1500s. Very interesting. So there's 1,000 years. There's 1,000 years. Nobody cares to be buried at all. But I did, in my mind, disprove the idea of the J and the I, that they were added 1,000 years. I need to give a whole presentation on that. I have so much evidence on it. As far as I'm concerned, there is literally 2,000 years between us and Messiah.
That's right.
1,500 years back to the mass extinction event, according to all the data we can collect all over the world, not just, trees all over the world, but, in ice and all over, it all lines up. And then of course the 500 years between Messiah and what we're talking about here. So
I agree with every word you said, because to me, once you see this, not only does it honor God and the Torah and the writing and the ministry of Yeshua and the apostles, but it makes sense, because this is God's plan laid out in plain sight, and my trust is more in the Lord than what some theory on distorted history might be. I really think this is God's plan. It's been laid out. You have to do a lot of digging to find it, but it's there and hidden in plain sight, which the enemy likes to do all the time, and God does it way better. But yeah, if there's anything, I don't know if that's Second Peter, but Eusebius, and we'll talk about him a little later. Eusebius hated Chiliasm, and he actually argued that Second Peter should not be in the canon. He why? Because it is Second Peter 3 that lays down the foundation of Christian Chiliasm. And if you could get rid of Second Peter, you could avoid a lot of stuff if you want to justify other eschatological views. But it's in there, and when you break it down with the LXX, you have to deal with some big questions. And so
this is probably one of the,
obviously
none of us really knows why Papias was eliminated of his 5 volumes of the quotes and the sayings of Yahshua, by the apostles and that kind of stuff. That had to be some of the most amazing, resource information for the early church. But we can all speculate on why it was. But I think that this was a huge issue. aside from the
Yes,
fact
it
that he
was.
was probably very Nazarene, right? And so you have the church
Hmm.
fathers who are trying to, they want the tradition, they want like the Pope in their traditions to go back to Peter, and they are more lawless. So they can't have that. But this was obviously probably a big driving issue for sure. And I know you're going to cover more of that tonight.
Yeah, I mean, once you see that, you know, you understand why the doctrines got changed. It's so obvious. It's so obvious. But yeah, let's go. I want to do my little season Satan hypothesis real quick using Chiliasm. Now, my suspicion is Papias probably had some stuff in his 5 books about the little season, but we don't have it. It's been lost. But
Yeah.
if you know, what about the little season? You know, what does that do? If you go down to who writes about it, let me know if there's more, uh, because these are the only two I've been able to find so far. But like Changes Divine Institutes, he has a whole chapter about it. It's really interesting. He seems to think that it happens within the 7 millennium, uh, but towards the end. But he doesn't say how long. And I'm going to talk about how why I think he may have made that conclusion and why he may not have seen what we're going through coming. And it makes perfect sense. We'll get into that later. And then there's Vic. I don't know how to say his name, but he had a commentary on the apocalypse, and most of it is missing. So it's fragments. But the little bit that we have when he wrote about the little season is he says it would take place for about 3.5 years, and so he thinks that, well, this is an interesting thought based off of what he wrote. He thought that what Satan did in the 500 years from Jesus to the fall of Rome, he would kind of repeat the same things. And so he said 3.5 antichrists. I mean, he said that there's going to be another antichrist essentially in that, which I found real fascinating. So he kind of thinks Satan is going to come out and kind of rinse and repeat. Essentially, is what he thought. So, but there's just not a lot there.
There's
And
there's another, yeah, and I'm with you on that. That there's a very, it's almost, I don't know, I won't say it's troubling, but there's very little on, like, I think that nobody's really focus was on that, right? All these people
that's
were
right.
focusing on it's the same thing today with the end times eschatological people today. They don't put a focus on the little season because they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about, they want to experience the millennial kingdom, right? Like,
That's right.
that's 1,000 years off. We don't really know. We don't really know. But the other one I was going to point out is in the book of the two pearls. It does talk about it. It actually says that Satan would have a reign over the earth to basically, tempt and trick people for 10 days. So
Mm,
I don't know what I don't know. I don't know if the 10 days is prophetic or code or what, but I don't know why they put 10 days. What that implies, if they just thought it was a literal 10 days, I don't really know. But
right.
so you
Yeah.
you don't get too
It's
much
just
of a
not.
number.
It's not consistent. It's just not consistent with the time frame. And so when I put together, we kind of made a lot of the points here, but only Barnabas is the one that I can find that talks about the 8th millennium. And he says, upon on that 8th day, God will create a new creation. He says that, and so he's the only one who writes on the 8th. But he's very clear that it doesn't really make sense for sin and death to still be around in the 8th day. And so I'm not comfortable saying that we're in the 8th day, even though we're in the year close to 7,500. I'm not comfortable saying that's the 8th day, and I have a
Well,
good thought behind it.
yeah, I mean, I thought a lot about this too, and I know where you're going with this. On the there was no evening on the seventh day, right? So it isn't a
Yeah.
long. I think that's where you're going on it. That's where a lot of
Yep.
people go. But there's a lot that's supposed to happen on the eighth day. I mean, you look at like circumcision on the eighth day, right? You as a child, you circumcise the baby on the eighth day, which is and there's a lot of, you go through all the cleansing that happens on the eighth day, all these very important things on the eighth day, and it's pointing to the eighth day of creation when we are, the ultimate circumcision of the heart, and everything, right? Like it's the eighth great day of Sukkot, right? It's a very, very, very important day. And so I don't know if we're in the eighth day or not. I think that we could be.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking aloud
It's on the
that,
table. It's on the
if
table.
if you have 1,000 years, right, it doesn't have to be like the the fulfillment of the promises of the eighth great day doesn't have to happen on the first day or the first, whatever, the first calendar year of 1,000 years, right? It could be in the last 500 years, the last 600-700 years, whatever. It could it could happen still. We have a long ways to go. What I'm saying is, and I know what you're going to cover tonight, and we could all be dead and our grandchildren could be dead, and you still got plenty of time to, what is it? If you go back 500 years, we're looking at like my 15th great grandfather. So
Yep.
we could have a lot of generations still ahead of us.
Yeah, and so it's not really clear, and that's one of the things I want to set up is that the little season. In fact, go ahead and go to the next slide. The writers, they were so focused on the millennial reign that they didn't really care about it. They were interested in figuring out when Rome would fall. They weren't interested in when the devil would be released. But let's go ahead. Go down to the. Oh yeah, by the way, Revelations 20 slide. Go to it's like number 12. It's fascinating to me that the word thousand which is where Chiliasm comes from, is used 6 times in that chapter. And if
Yeah.
you do addition, that's 6,000 years. And at the end of 6,000 years is the millennial reign. And that's in Genesis 20. I just think that's an interesting coincidence there. But if you look at it, there is a hypothesis. If you go to Little Season hypothesis, the word thousand, talking about 6,000 years, you have the short time. I think it's reasonable to believe that the short time of Satan will be less than 1,000 years. I think that's highly likely. I would confidently say that is, but I'm not entirely comfortable saying the exact year or whatever because that's up for debate, and I'm not going to try to do that. But there is a possibility. And then go
So
ahead.
let me throw this at you too, and just see what your thoughts are. This is one of the things I think about that in our thinking. Let's just say, like, because there's a lot of fascinating things that happened around the year 1500. Just
Mhm.
going across Europe this last year, I have been amazed at how much of a worldwide change there was in the year 1500. But let's say we can just let's say theoretically that the millennial kingdom came to an end in the year 1500. All right. But
Yeah.
what if Satan wasn't released for another 250 years?
Mm.
Like, does it have to be, and I'm just curious on your thoughts on this. Does he have to be released immediately? Or could there be a section of time where he's not, and then he has his little season that he's released for? Like, what if he wasn't released till, we all know the date, 1776, for example. That's
Yeah.
probably a very American kind of thinking date. I mean, you got the French Revolution, you got a lot of different, dates you could look at. But
Mhm.
what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I tend to believe that he was released around 1500. I tend to
Okay.
believe that one. One is, and you pointed this out on your channel, is it King Henry the Seventh or Eighth with the Red Dragon?
Yeah.
The return to the Red Dragon is just so, I don't know. That's just too much of a coincidence. And there's other things that are like that too. Um, and also the rise of secret societies. uh, there just seems to be so much deception behind the scenes and also I just think corrupt people fall over themselves too much, that you need supernatural, smart, intelligent beings to pull off plans that go over centuries because people are too backstabby and all that kind of stuff. So, uh,
Okay. Hold on, James. Wait, hold on, James. Hopefully everyone can. James, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, James, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Okay, can you hear me right now? Because I can't hear you. Can anyone listening? I got about 50 listeners right now. Can you write in the comments whether you can hear James right now, or am I the crazy one? Because I figure if I can't hear him, then you guys can't either. Anyone? Something happened, James. So I think you can hear me. Something happened where you got cut out and went black, and then you came back and you were silent. Okay, they can't hear James. They can't hear you. They can hear me, but not you, James. All right. So, James, can you do something? Can you here? Let me. can you come back into the studio? Can you signal if you can hear me? Can you hear me? You can't hear me. Okay. Here's what I'm going to do. Okay. I just did the rudest thing ever, and I just kicked him out of the studio. It's part of the boot camp here at Talk, the training program. Got to whip him into tip-top shape. I'm going to message him and see if he wants to come back, and we'll continue this conversation. Yeah, Dana, you got my guests. My regular viewers have this down. Okay, you're back, James. I can hear you. Perfect.
Okay, good. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. What was the last thing you said?
I don't remember the last thing I said. It's funny that StreamYard is really, it's really moody. And so I'm doing all these, on a side note, I'm doing all these interviews every week with Hunter Tylo, because the project I'm working on right now is co-writing the book with her. So we're going through all these sessions, and every single time, like, somebody texts her on her phone, it just like it freezes up and I lose her and she has to come back in.
Well,
So
I put my phone on airplane mode, so hopefully that'll make a difference.
okay. All right. So we were,
but,
I don't remember what we were.
Oh yeah,
we were
talking about the Satan really come out at the end of the millennial kingdom and everything. And there's just too many things. And other things I want to throw out is the biggest arguments against Christendom came out during the 1500s with Copernicus. You have definitely a lot of deliberate and well thought out delusions and deceptions occur. You have all those type of things, and so you have the Enlightenment appear, which is, hey, let's go back to Rome, which is kind of like red flag. And then America, are we a Christian nation? If we were a Christian nation, wouldn't we have gone to I don't know, Moses to structure our country? And not the Roman Empire or Rome the Republic. So so there's too many of those things that make me kind of scratch my head that there's more going on behind the scenes. And
it's
so
of course with the 1500s you get the Renaissance and the big reveal, because I'm in Italy right now. I'm in ground zero of the Renaissance. Been going to a lot of museums. I saw David for the first time this week. I will say that David is very impressive to see in person. My wife and I were both like, dang, that's pretty impressive. But the big reveal of the Renaissance is that whether you knew it or not, everybody in the Bible was naked. Apparently, like, nobody wore clothes in the naked in the Bible.
The art,
just Renaissance art. They just derobe themselves.
Right.
And of course, one of the big discussions my wife and I were having was whether Michelangelo, he decided on a circumcised David or not. We were having that discussion. But anyways, go ahead.
Well, so I want to throw this at you. And this goes back to my little season hypothesis. But if you and this is also correlated to what you're talking about. If you go to slide 14, where it shows Genesis 1:37, and you point this out, each day in Genesis has, at the very end of the creation cycle, says there was evening and there was morning, the first day, the sixth day. Yeah. And then you go to chapter 2, and it just doesn't say that on the seventh day about the Sabbath. And so one of the things that I propose, and I think it's fascinating, you see this in the book of Hebrews too, about the question that's brought up. I think it's Hebrews 4 about that the rest did not end, that the rest was left open, is actually a discussion in Hebrews. And he quotes David and all this kind of stuff. And so he talks about, well, the Sabbath didn't end. It's actually an interesting statement. But when you take that to the cosmic week, and if you go to the next slide, there's something I want to read here. It says, it can be assumed that the time duration of the first 6 days is the same except for day 7. Did God ever extend a day in the scriptures? And he does. In Joshua, God extends a day by 12 hours. And it's the daytime that he extends by 12 hours. Now take that into account with Chiliasm, making a 36-hour day. In Chiliasm thinking, this would be about 1,500 years. So you remember I talked about how there's a day and night cycle in a millennium, but with the seventh day, it's backwards. There's 2 500-year periods of daytime, and then the second would be nighttime, which would be 500 years. It seems like it's flipped backwards and then it's doubled on light. So you have two periods of light, and then you have a period of darkness, which would be about a 500 year, at least a 500-year cycle. So that could be interesting. And also, when you look at the name of that book is Yeshua, the name of Joshua is the same as Yeshua. There's some stuff going on there. But if you can go to the next one where it shows the days right there. So I'm proposing the possibility of a day 7 extension. There is no evening and morning on the Sabbath, meaning that day 7 would be longer than the previous 6. And also, Jesus was in the pit for longer than 24 hours. Now, I want you to take that into account. When he went down on Friday, he stayed in the depths, and he rose on the Sunday morning. So he was down in the rest. You could call it the rest, whatever, for more than 24 hours. So that's an interesting statement. But the hypothesis is saying that Satan is released to deceive the nations of the world, and concludes in a final battle against the saints with Gog and Magog. Oh, and that's another thing I want to point out too. The Gog and Magog war, you have different interpretations with the two guys I referred to on Little Season. One believes that the battle will actually be against the saints, the resurrected saints. And then the other writer, it thinks it's the church or the assembly. It's the followers of Yod. It's not the resurrected group. And there's not a consistency in that too. So, it's, but you hear a lot of thoughts on the internet, especially in the MLK movement, on where are the saints? Do they have a floating city? Do they, you get into all those kind of conversations with it, but it's just not clear that I've been able to find on what that means. But that's the hypothesis of the little season. Now, I do want to note this too, and like I said, I don't believe in date setting, and I don't want to do that. But um, the year 7,500, which I think is around uh, 2036, if God wanted to be poetic, and I'm not saying He will, because I even doubt fully if I know the exact year. The more I look into this, I don't really know. But the year 7,500 would be Sunday morning on the cosmic week, and I do find that fascinating because that was when Yeshua rose, um, and he came at the dawn. He also originally came at the dawn of the sixth age. It would be fascinating if he comes at this dawn. I'm not saying he will, but it is an interesting poetic possibility, and it would be fascinating to see if God wants to do that. So, anyways, that's the little season hypothesis. And like I said, when it comes to this stuff, I use the word hypothesis because this one is a tough one. I'm not going to say absolutely. It's a possibility, you know. So
Yeah, this is it's kind of a head scratcher, I know, for a lot of. I mean, you're one of those guys, James, that you are very well read in the church fathers and that kind of stuff. And I think that for many similar people who are this well read, it's a head scratcher, right? Like this
yeah,
idea, it's like, how could we advocate something where there is so little known about it uh, in church history? You know, maybe I don't know. We could talk about, maybe there's conspiracy of silence, or whatever. Maybe books were destroyed. I don't know. We could put our hypothesis out on that, but it's
well,
definitely
I have a few thoughts, and I think some of it might actually be in the next section here, which is why was Chiliasm forgotten? So this goes back to, was there a cover up of it? And I think the obvious answer is yes. So it maybe perhaps before we get into this, there was a lot of stuff written about the little season, but we don't have it anymore. It's gone.
yeah.
We don't have the five books of Papias. I think that's a reasonable argument based, and when we get into that, I think those who are watching this will actually see that that is actually a reasonable statement. They were there, but we don't have them now, and I don't think that's unreasonable. But so one of the things, John, this goes back to the 70 AD doctrine issue, and this is all correlated here. Why was Chiliasm forgotten? That's a big question to ask. Why is it that virtually no one I know knows anything about that word? And why is it that when most people go back and they do research on the early church, they're just like, oh yeah, they were premillennial. Were they? What do you mean by premillennial? Do you mean modern dispensational premillennialism that you think of? So I see a lot of people who are actually really well educated. They got the PhD and all this stuff next to their name, but they're going back to the church fathers and making them say something that agrees kind of with their theological view. They're not hearing them out. They're not letting them explain it. They're not. And once you see, especially the LXX calendar, there's cohesion in thought. There's a lot of cohesion. There's not on everything, but by and large, there's a lot of crossover where they all agreed on. So why was it forgotten? Well, if you go to the next slide, the Great Apostasy. And I remember I read your book, and you brought up the 10 weeks of Enoch, and you were one of the first people who wasn't trying to slap on a 700-year period for each week. You made a point that is kind of more of this happens then this happens. It's not necessarily an exact equal space of time per week. And in
Well,
the weeks of Enoch, you had the destruction of the temple, and then afterwards, it talks about the apostasy,
yeah.
and that seems to be exactly what happened.
And there would be actually a reference to the destruction of the temple right there. Now that I think about it, but yeah, so and I pointed out because I was developing this. It was so weird when I was like looking at this calendar, the 7,000 years. I was nobody else was talking about this, and I'm just looking at these books, going like, I felt like it was almost like with like the flat earth when a lot of us were coming around to it 10 years ago, and we started discovering the writings of the flat earthists in the 1800s, and it was amazing to see these other people having these same conversations. And I'm looking and I'm seeing all these church followers and others having these discussions on what we're talking about tonight, and I'm just like, this is amazing. But I was Enoch was really messing with my head because I do not like math. And I point out to everybody that the 7,000 year timeline deception, you really don't need a calculator for it. You can just count on your finger 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's not that hard. But with Enoch, I'm getting out my calculator and I'm punching in numbers and nothing is adding
It's
up
hard.
right.
Yeah.
And I'm trying like algebra and all this kind of stuff and forget geometry, whatever you have to get into. But I finally, I'm just like, you know what? Like, you could see in Enoch these different events. You could see the events happening in scripture. And I don't really know at the end of the day how he completely did it. But yeah, so
Yeah, well, and
there's
I,
that.
I have I have a full chart where I take the 10 weeks of Enoch and I put it on the cosmic week, and you just, and sometimes you have more than one week that occurs in a millennium and stuff like that. But the thing is that the sequential order of events matches the cosmic week better than anything I've ever seen. Not in the duration of each week, but in the order of events. It's pretty obvious that it starts talking about the millennial kingdom when it starts talking about the millennial kingdom.
When I was, and it also appears to me too, just to throw this out there, that when we're looking at like cathedrals, and we don't need to talk about cathedrals tonight, but I spent a lot of time looking at cathedrals this last year in person. I was just at one a couple days ago in Florence, the biggest of the Middle Ages, a beautiful one, and they all say the same thing, that the cathedrals weren't being built until about 1100, 1000. Now, I have um, I have gone more and more towards this sort of evidence. And it appears, people say, oh, they just made that up and that kind of stuff. There's actually a lot of good reasons for why they have those dates. At the end of the day, they don't completely know, but I could take you to those cathedrals and I could show you the different layers in these cathedrals that actually match up with what the texts are saying, this kind of stuff. But my point is that it in Enoch's calendar, it's kind of interesting because it does seem to me that the millennial kingdom is ushered into place, and that they don't start building these places right away. It's about halfway through when they start building them. And and so what I'm saying constantly is that, guys, like, everyone's like, oh, all history's made up, it's all a lie. And it's like, no. Satan is still working through tree rings. He's still working through, like, you've got some things in place. He's still working with the columns, guys. He can lie to you about what's in those columns and that kind of stuff, but he still has these hoops he's got to jump through. And to make this convincing. But I was going to say about with the Enoch's calendar, when I was researching this about 5, 6 years ago, and I started looking at a lot of different theories of Enoch's calendar, I always found it interesting that most of the Christians looking into it, they would really have a hard time when it came to the age of apostasy, and
Yes.
they wanted to bump it up before Messiah
Uh,
because they didn't want the age of apostasy to be after Messiah because of what that would imply.
yep.
The
That's right.
implication being that they did away with the Torah, they did away with the law, and that can't possibly be the apostasy, you see. But it is. That is part of the apostasy. And Constantine was not the savior, at least according to official history, everything we know about. The Latin kings were, a very anti quote unquote Jewish, and what you're
That's
going to
right.
talk about
That's
that.
right.
So
Yeah, yeah. And so the apostasy is real. Peter talks about it in 2 Peter 3, and he says in the last days there will be, kind of this apostasy. He starts talking about it. I think last days, I think there's two periods of apostasy. I think the 36, the 536 is the first apostasy, and then the one that we're in right now. I believe that's also within the last days statement of Peter. Go to the next slide. One of my least favorite people in history, the great apostasy, Emperor Apostasy himself. Next slide with Constantine. So I want to make these points here. I think it's real fascinating. So Constantine became emperor and merges the fourth beast with the church. It's important that I use that language. Okay.
mhm.
Merges the fourth beast with the church. That it already tells you everything here. There are several Christian doctrines that prevent this from occurring, meaning there's a lot of teaching that says, don't you ever merge with that beast, ever. Don't you think you can tame it? It is the enemy, and so the church fathers that made friendship with the beast, and one of them is this guy that I keep holding up here, Eusebius. He helped to change core Christian doctrines away from orthodoxy, and this includes Chiliasm and other things as well. And I'll get into that here. So go to the next slide here. This is real fascinating. So what doctrines were in the way? And now there's a lot more than this, but these are the three that I want to focus on because I know you covered others in your other videos. But jurisdiction of angel doctrines, which we'll get into that one, what that means. But that gets in the way of Rome. Chiliasm eschatology really gets in the way of Rome. And then the LXX chronology, St. Jerome. Why did he want to change some certain things? And why did the Latin Vulgate would go with the Masoretic and not, So and there are more, but I just want to look at these three here. The If you go to the next slide, jurisdiction of angels doctrine. So this was always something around 2004 when I started to look into the sons of God. And this was before Michael Heiser came on the scene. I want to say, yeah, 2003, 2004. Michael Heiser was talking about stuff, but he hadn't become popular yet. And I know Rob Skiba referred to him a lot on this stuff. But I always thought it was weird as why am I having a debate on whether or not this is the sons of Seth or is this angels? Why are we debating these two things, right? Because it's obvious in church history, the oldest and only interpretation was that it was angels until
Yep.
it came later. So why change it? Doesn't that seem like a weird doctrine to suddenly say, "Hey, let's make this the sons of Seth and the sons of Cain"? Why would that even matter? And the reason why is that the sons of God teaching in Genesis 6 sets up the understanding of God's divine dividing the nations at Babel under the heavenly host of angels, which is in Deuteronomy 32. I think it's
I
verse 5.
No, I'm in agree with you. What I think they would say is that the sons of Seth theory, which I actually do think that there is some precedence for the sons of Seth theory, but just I'm fully on board with the
Sure.
sons of God theory in Enoch, but that both could be there. But my point is
Oh,
that
they are. Yes.
I think what they would say is that um, the modern sons of Seth theory actually aligns with Moses's original vision, but what happened was there was this weird divergence in the age of Hellenization where they really got into angelology, and angels having
Yeah.
sex with people, and so they created Jubilees and Enoch and some of those other texts in like the first second century BC. They did that weird diversion, but then Christianity properly corrected course again, a
Yeah.
few centuries down the line. I think that's how they would probably explain it.
Well, you just described exactly how Eastern Orthodoxy approached this. The church, they would say that the early church who believed in the angel stuff, they were immature in their faith. And that the reason why this doctrine changed, among others, is because the church was reaching maturity. That they honestly say that. That's actually what they teach. And I agree with you. I think it's actually both, but I do believe when it says sons of God, it is talking about angels. But there was definitely a tension between the sons of Seth and the sons of Cain, because those are, you get those two genealogies in Genesis. So that tension is there. That's obvious, but that doesn't mean that this doesn't fit also. You know, and so they want to do an either or. And like I said, when it comes to debates, it's usually not a either or. It's oftentimes this going on here.
Yeah.
But but this understand that the sons of God is referring to a ruling class of angels is actually tied to having issues with Rome. Why does this threaten Rome? Because those who understood this understood that the angels over empires are fallen. And you had the Prince of Persia. So this is a natural headspace for the early church. So changing the sons of God to refer to the sons of Seth was essential in eliminating the tension between Rome and the church. And I really believe that. Now there's multiple reasons on that on top of that, but when you're getting into politics, you're going to have cover stories. You know, what's really behind the scenes. And if you're in this time period, like I point out with Chiliasm, Papias understood this. He understood that the angel council failed and that it would be replaced by the saints and that the angels rule all over the nations. That's an important fundamental of a worldview, and in order to understand what is the kingdom of God and what is not. And that's just a byproduct of that understanding. So the next one is eliminating Chiliasm. Now,
And I
this
know
one
that
is,
I was going to just add in real quick too, like when you get to like St. Augustine as well,
yeah,
and by the time you get to him, and he is, he is an agent, of course, for Rome, and he's like, guys, this is like, no, you're like this idea that there's this kingdom coming. No, this is it. This is like this is the city of God. Like it's
that's
here,
right.
and it's you got to give it to the Pope, and whoever is the emperor, whoever's ruling. There is no divine council. There are no angels above us. This kind of stuff. It's just them. They are ruling on this earth. That seemed to be
That's
the
right.
big emphasis. Yeah.
Well, and that's the one with eliminating Chiliasm. This is what a lot of people, and I knew this, but I didn't connect the dots. No, and it's like Chiliasm is hostile towards Rome. What is? I don't mean that the church would fight against Rome. They saw it as the enemy. You know, it was the Darth Vader, it was the Skeletor, it was the Shredder. You know, we're
The
not going to join the
Skeletor.
Foot. Yeah, we're not going to join the Foot Clan and,
I
and
know
and
you
live in
watched
Snake
as a
Mountain.
child.
Exactly. And it was very hostile towards Rome. We're not bending the knee. We'll die. And also, and we'll get into this because it was clear that the fourth beast, all of the believers in Killisum who go into detail made this very clear. The beast is Rome. The fourth beast is Rome. They weren't confused by this. It was pretty obvious. Okay. And they also understood that the fourth beast would not be allowed to go into the millennial reign era. They knew that, and we'll get into that a little later. The majority of martyrs were believers of Killisum. Now, this is a huge point, Noel, and they believed they would reign with Christ. You want to know why the church was willing to go into the sword? Because they had a fully realized hope. And my biggest hangup with preterism is my hope was very weak, very weak. Killisum actually gives you incredible hope because you realize he wants to not only bring you into the family of God, he wants you to reign with him, and he wants
No,
to make that.
give me an example because a lot of um, preterism, it seems like because a lot of people are coming into preterism, and
Mhm.
I would think that a lot of people would maybe confuse or mistake or think what you're describing is preterism of I can't even pronounce it, killism, whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
so give me a practical example in your own life of something where you were losing hope because of preterism. Like what was something that was causing you to that you look back on and you're like, that
Yeah,
the
well,
cause
I'll
and
tell
effect
you.
of it.
Well, the main thing is the difference when I studied Killisum and in the Millennial Kingdom, I realized I understood better the purpose of mankind. That God is going to get what He wanted from the very beginning, creation. Most preterists, especially full preterists with 70 AD, they say everything was fulfilled at 70 AD. Okay, and that this earth continuing when you die, you just go to heaven is kind of their teaching, and it undermines the plan of God of what he was trying to do with Adam, and it also separates the physical and spiritual again. No, he made humans to be spiritual and physical. He made us for a creation. I know there's seen and unseen sides to this creation, but we seem to be able to go back and forth between two at the resurrection. But I didn't have any headspace on what God's plan for mankind was. It was very confusing to me, understanding what happens when I die and what is the afterwards. And in Killism, it's pretty clear. On the eighth day, he's going to create a new world, and all of the saints who are raised and remain faithful to him and not the beast, they get to live there with him and reign with him and all this type of stuff. And when I think on those things, I get excited. I'm like, man, okay, I'll be willing to let go of this world for what is to come, because the best moment in this world does not compare to what is to come. And that's, to me, better understood and realized with Killism. And I can understand better why the church would die under the sword for that. I have a hard time dying under the sword for fragments and misunderstandings and not having a clarity of what God intended man to be and to become. I know people who think that heaven is just sitting on a cloud and singing for eternity. That's not what I get from the Killism worldview. No, he made us to co-rule. Who knows what he has in store in the future? Will there be other creations? I mean, even the church father says we'll be like angels. How did he use angels in the Old Testament? We're coming in and interacting with his creation. So it opens up a world of, wow, I get to spend eternity with God, serving the kingdom and going out and doing whatever he tells me to do. It gives you a completely different headspace, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so anyway, so I can understand why the martyrs would die for that. That sounds beautiful. That sounds amazing. You know, that I can be okay with letting go of this world, knowing that what God has in store for us. That sounds, awesome. And then the third point here is, so introducing amillennialism, taught the millennial reign began at the cross and resurrection of Messiah. So Rome becoming Christian was proof that the kingdom was taking over and that the 1,000 years, which is metaphoric, was happening. So a lot of I've seen other people who are in this MLK camp who will quote Saint Augustine as if maybe he wrote that during the millennial kingdom. They don't understand his theology. He is not he does not like Killism. He used to be one, and he changed his mind. He's promoting all millennialism so that they can shake hands with the beast. That's
Yep.
what's really going on, and it's political, completely political. And then the next one, eliminating the XXL chronology. So the XXL held up chrono messianism, which is what we spent a good part of tonight talking about, which is that Jesus is hidden in the text, and the chronology, the boring genealogies, are all pointing to the Messiah. And the cosmic week in other ways of predicting the coming of Messiah, but also it wasn't just the coming of Messiah. The cosmic week actually predicts the fall of Rome, and Killism predicts the fall of Rome. So that's politically not good. Okay, that's not in the favor of Constantine here, and that's not in the favor of Rome, the Christian Rome that came after her. So the Jews changed the Masoretic text to avoid the identity of Messiah, and you can add to that the Millennial Kingdom. Saint Jerome changed the church over to Masoretic text, which became the Latin Vulgate. Protestants continued Jerome's approach to canon. So the most common Bibles used today no longer have the historical chronology, and it's near impossible to discover the cosmic week with the Masoretic Bible. You
Yep.
just can't do it. You just can't do it. So this is political. All of this is political. And so why did the church take the bait? This is a big one, because, and it's so simple when you think about it, because it eliminated persecution and martyrdom. If you change eschatology and Rome is now your friend, you don't have to worry about dying. And after a couple centuries of the church being under the sword, that must kind of grow weary. There must have been a group saying, we're tired of this. And so an appeal of peace, to have peace, that is not a small thing. That would have been something that, boy, I want peace. But Jesus is saying, no, 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 wait for the peace to come with the kingdom. This is not true peace here. So they took the bait, and so began the death of Chiliasm. And however, in order to rule out Chiliasm, you would have to wait till around, this is where it gets interesting. You would actually have to wait to 500 AD to see if Rome and the world would be destroyed by a horrible cataclysm. Okay. They got rid of it in the 4th century before this could be proven. And you have Lactantius saying in one of the last chapters in his book, it's Divine Institutes. I recommend people who are interested in the Millennial Kingdom to check it out. It's real. It's got the sibling oracles and everything in it. But the chapter right before the release of Satan, he says that this will happen. He's talking about the beginning of the millennial reign, the fall of Rome, will happen 200 years from now. And this was written around 311 or later. So you do the math, that puts you around 511. And this guy was right. He was right. You have to wait 200 years. Well, they didn't do that. And so
I was
we talked about
pretty
this earlier.
yeah, we were talking about this earlier.
Yeah.
I was really that was really interesting when I was looking at the quotes from some of these guys, and they seem pretty confident, like this is where we're at on the calendar, and we believe this, and so we've got a couple hundred years to go, and you get this kind of anticipation. But as you get
Yeah.
closer and closer, you're seeing more opposition to the view, where they're like, "No, this is not going to happen."
Yeah.
You see more of the controllers stepping in there.
Well, and I don't want to get into this, but what's going on here is that Rome has to get rid of opposition. So you have to create a new church in order to appease the tension between the beast and the church. And what you do is you create an apostasy. And this is all political, all of it. And unfortunately, when you're talking to most people who try to say, well, what I believe is what the early church taught, usually 9 times out of 10, though, this is what I found, when they say this is what the early church taught, they open up St. Augustine, they, they they open up the Roman church literature, and they don't actually go and read the first 100 years of church writing, because you're going to find a very different persuasion in those writings. And so a lot of people's view of early church is actually the Constantine era and after. It is not the pre Constantine. And you have to be careful because the digression was already starting. These doctrines that we just pointed out didn't just come up around 300. They were starting to be introduced in the 3rd century, especially in the second part of that century, and then the devil capitalized on it with Constantine. And he says,
We
let's pull these in the forefront.
Yeah, well, you even have the Alexandrian guys too that were kind of taking over a lot of doctrine too before Constantine, like like Origin, or some of those guys. And there's some of those things, those guys would say that I would find interesting. I don't want to like cast everyone out,
Yeah.
but you definitely see that there was more and more of a pull away from, like, it seems like everybody wanted to. There was a big push to say that, like, I am standing on the foundation of the apostles. I am the tradition of the apostles. And they were trying to pull more and more away from typical Hebrew Jewish thinking, that kind of stuff, and having to erase some of that thought. You see more and more of a push away from it.
Yeah, I mean, Eusebius writes that Papias was essentially an imbecile moron. Or Eusebius, I
Yeah.
mean, he literally says that. In fact, the fragments of Papias that we have, which I recommend people to buy this Apostolic Fathers. It's the Greek and English 3rd edition. Michael
I have
W.
that same
Holmes.
book.
Yeah, but most of the fragments of Papias, which are just little fragment sections taken from other people's writings, most of them are taken from this time period, basically saying that Papias is a moron. Like literally say that he's wrong, he's wrong. But yet Irenaeus points out the lineage of Chiliasm. He takes it all the way to John and the apostles, and he talks about who was taught by from the apostles, who they taught it to. Polycarp, he claims, did it. You pointed out the Phoenix prophecy with First Clement, which means that he was aware of the cosmic week. And it's so obviously that this is Chiliasm is what they understood and knew. And to say that Papias is a moron, you're not just saying he's a moron. You're also saying Peter is. You're also saying Paul is. Moses is. Because this was not a Christian thing. This was a Jewish setup here. They understood these concepts. It did not originate from Papias. It came from before the apostles, and the apostles believed it. And I think there's enough in what's called the New Testament to actually make that argument. But if we have time, I want to talk briefly. It's my concerns with the MLK movement. This is where I talk about 70 AD and setting up here. And if
Yeah,
you could
yeah.
go to
This is
this
good.
slide 20, 28, well, 27. I would like to read this. And this part of my grammar, this is I need to do another edit here, but it says if you try to interpret the past with modern eschatology or Romanized Christian beliefs, then you will come to new ideas that never existed. And that's what I see a lot of in the MLK movement right now, is that they haven't weeded, like, I talked about getting out of the cult. I spent 10 years getting that junk out of my head. Okay. 10 years, no. And when you don't know that it's in there, you have a lens over your eyes that when you go and you read somebody, we by default impart our assumptions of our experience onto text. It takes a lot of time and
Like,
hard work or research and study to allow the text to tell you what it's trying to say.
yeah,
And we don't do that.
I've I've had a kind of and we were talking about this, I think, last summer on the phone.
Yeah.
The frustration that I've had. I like how you call it the MLK movement, but the frustration I've had, and I watched. I've been in this where, at the very beginning, I didn't know anybody in this. There was very few people talking about it, and then I've watched this thing grow and grow and grow. And as all these people are rushing into it, I'm asking people, can we like slow down and kind of and get our bearings on some kind of biblical understanding, theology, worldviews, because
Yeah.
they are grabbing this churchianity that they're coming out of. They're not losing a lot of their doctrines and a lot of their
That's
beliefs, and
right.
they're carrying over a lot of their, they'll go claiming, Zionism is wrong, and whatever, but they're still holding on to maybe dispensational views or all sorts of things, or as you call it, Romanized views, and they're they're just running with this like it must be so, and they're
Right.
coming up with some, I think, some, I'll say wacky ideas. I guess they could say the same thing about me, and people who are against us, the millennial kingdom happening, they can say we're all wacky too. But I'm
Yeah.
just kind of asking everybody, let's kind of like slow down and have, some discussions
Yeah.
on some of this stuff, and why we advocate what we're advocating.
Well, and I would encourage people to share this video that we're making right now with friends who believe in it, because my first point on slide 28 is most do not use Chiliasm, but rather a form of preterism. Well, this is going to put you in a problem automatically, especially when you realize that the early church, the church history, the earliest form of eschatology agrees that the millennial kingdom already took place. Like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here, Noel. It's already understood. And yet that's exactly what we're doing. And I hear from a lot of people when I watch the videos online that you guys have a new doctrine. No, this is actually the oldest. This is really the oldest doctrine. We didn't make anything up. We're just actually rediscovering it. And I
Yeah.
don't think a lot of people understand that. And so we have to be real careful about taking like certain points of preterism, like full preterism with 70 AD emphasis. That's a fairly new eschatology. Okay. Amillennialism is really kind of the next one, which was popularized by Rome, which was the metaphoric sense of revelation, and that the millennial kingdom is metaphoric, not a little 1,000 years, which is a common view today. That came later. And then you have, post millennial, and then you have, the rise of preterism with 70 AD. And then you have the modern futurist dispensational premillennialism. Um, what we're advocating is not anything new. It's really old. And I don't think a lot of people see that, but they put a lot of focus on 70 AD. And they also, I've seen a lot of this. They combine alternate history hypothesis, which I think, I mean, I'm not saying that's wrong, but they blend with also with the fall of Rome and with the 536 cataclysm. So what that means is they take the destruction of the temple, they take the fall of Rome, they take the 536 cataclysm, and they all say that's 70 AD. That's what I see, a lot of that. Okay.
Yes, and
And it,
I have been like, this has been a tug of war where, this is like the biggest thing that people are coming to me and they're saying it's like all the same event. And I'm trying to show them these texts and saying, no, that can't be, that's just not what I'm reading at all.
right.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead and
Yeah, I
finish that.
know. And I'll get into this a little later, but so Killism, when they read Matthew 24 and they read Revelations, they they have a big emphasis on Rome, not Jerusalem. And I'll get into that later. We have a strong emphasis on Jerusalem and not Rome. Okay. And I'll get into that a little later. Um, But anyways, this is the problem is preterism appeared during the little season of Satan, not in the early church history. And I think that's a big point. if you if you see the chronology and you look at where 70 AD preterism came from, it came from the little season. The early church that believed in Chiliasm didn't think much of the destruction of the temple, and for good reason. And I'm like I said, I'm in the early phases of this. No, that's when I reached out to
Yeah.
you, and I'm still making my mind. But it says, why didn't Chiliasm care much about 70 AD? On slide 29 said it wasn't the first time the temple had been destroyed. Now that's the big point. This was the second time it happened. Okay. And a lot of people, when they talk about the destruction of the temple, they don't really stop and consider Maccabees and stuff. This wasn't the first time the temple was destroyed. Okay. It had been destroyed before. Now, if this was the first destruction of the temple, then maybe that would be a bigger deal, but it's not. It's the second time. Okay. And that is something I think people need to think more about. But so the early church, when they're talking about the destruction of the temple, they often didn't talk about 70 AD. They would actually talk about Antiochus and the abomination of desolation. That to them was the bigger one than 70 AD, which isn't that interesting? Because if you look at the 70 preterists, you say, why don't you prioritize 70 AD? They prioritized the one in Maccabees. So, anyways, Jesus in Matthew 24 is answering three questions. When will the temple be destroyed? When is the sign of your coming? And when is the end of the age? Now, as soon as you say the end of the age to a Chilism, they're already thinking fall of Rome 500 AD. Okay, they're not thinking 70 AD. And also, he's being asked three questions. He is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, but don't forget the other two: his coming and then the end of the age. Okay, they tend to put more emphasis on his coming and the end of the age. The destruction of the temple was a minor point. Okay, and I'm just explaining the mindset of the early church. Okay, that's what I see in the writings. That's not me talking. That's what I'm seeing in the writings. They just don't care about the destruction of the temple. Um, so Killisum had a very specific understanding of ages, and when reading Matthew 24 and Revelations, they had a destruction of Rome focus, not a destruction of the temple focus.
Now
They were
let me just back up and clarify this, because some people are going to hear you say that, and they're going to, in their minds, they're going to say, well, that's proof then that Killism is a false belief. And I think that the way I would want to phrase this is that we actually don't see in the church fathers any talk of the destruction. Am I correct in this? That like the
the
70
closest I've been
AD.
able to find, there's inferring of perhaps the sacrificial system is gone, but they don't make a big deal about it. And then when they do talk about a rebuilding, it has to do with Antichrist. They say an Antichrist will rebuild the temple. But whenever they're talking about the scenario of the abomination of desolation, they talk about Maccabees. They ignore 70 AD as an abomination of desolation, and they
Yeah.
go straight to the Antichrist coming, rebuilding the temple, and sitting there. They don't pay any attention to 70 AD when they're talking about the order of those events.
Well, and I mean, you were the first one when we were, and I said this earlier tonight, that we were talking on the phone, and I was kind of stumped. I was like, wow, yeah, that's kind of interesting that, the people who are really against the idea of preterism, they point out that, where's all the evidence that Messiah returned? But it's more like, where's even the evidence that the temple was destroyed? I mean, you have Josephus,
Yep.
but you don't have the church fathers even talking about this. And you
It's not
would
a big
think
deal.
that this, well, yeah, and maybe something else is going on that we're missing. I don't know. Maybe there's something there. I don't really know, but yeah.
Well,
So
and
just
and
want
here's
to
another
point that out.
point. Yeah, and I want to say this here. No one in Chilism saw 70 AD as the coming of the Lord and the end of the age. I haven't been able to find anyone who says that, really. They do recognize the sacrificial system is altered. And that's that should be another video later on. But the abomination of desolation was Antiochus the fourth, and also when the Antichrist would rebuild the temple and sit on the throne in the temple, not 70 AD. So they have a completely different view of Matthew 24, and you could say, well, they weren't learned, they didn't have access to stuff, but that's a big deal. The way that preterism holds up 70 AD, why is that not a big deal to them? It's a big deal to us. It was a big deal to me for decades, but the early church is like, it's not. It's just not a weight. Anyways, additional reasons on the next slide. It says the Jews never left Christian history. I know when I was in the 70 AD, you kind of have this thought, well, they just kind of dispersed and disappeared for 2,000 years or whatever, and it's like they never left it. In fact, the church was constantly having issues with the Jews. They didn't disappear after 70 AD. Irenaeus writes on how they are changing the Old Testament writings, pointing to Messiah. So they're still contending with the Jews far into this age period, and I think that's
Well,
fascinating because a lot of predators act like the Jews kind of just went, and really no, they're still around.
yeah, and part of the of course the evidence of this as well, as I point out with my Nazarene research, that the biggest insult you could call anybody was a Jew, and
Mm.
they had the Jew tax, and so there was a huge push to not to hold to Jewish ideas, not to do Jewish things, because it became very politicized. And so you had many of the church fathers who were trying to push away from even the feast and all that kind of stuff. So I mean that's
Yeah,
just more evidence for me that there was still Judaism. If there was a threat that you could be identified as being one of the Jews, it just goes to show that they were still there. They weren't something
yeah.
in the past.
Well, and I know this is something that that you did a video on and everything, but the great apostasy and the whore of Babylon would be the church blending with the Roman Empire, essentially. That's how they would have seen it.
Okay.
And it did. The Rome that was destroyed in 536 AD was an abomination of Christianity. It really was. And then you go to Peter says something in Peter 1 Peter 5:12 through 13, in verse 13 she says he's referring to the church who is in Babylon. Of course they weren't allowed to say Rome because that's antagonistic to that time period. So the cover label would be Babylon. Chosen together with you, sends you greetings, as does Mark, my son. And then talking about the beast here, Revelation 13:11, and this is Chiliasm's understanding of things. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and then it spoke like a dragon. And then something is missing here is that essentially Constantine's Rome looks like a blend of the lamb and the dragon. Okay, and that's early Chiliasm would have seen it that way. Don't mix with the beast. Don't do it. That's evil. Okay, I think your last guest last week was talking about the two kingdoms. What he's saying
I,
is essentially how Chiliasm thought before Constantine.
I was just thinking about Randy Conway, who I had on last week. He would probably, if he's watching this, he's probably like, yeah, because that's what he was talking about last week.
Yeah, and so Chiliasm sees that naturally. Is just, I guess, a fundamental. That's what they see. So reasons to question preterism, and this is a good one here. Often Josephus, Taccius, and Eusebius are held up as additional books of the Protestant Bible. Instead of 66 books, there's 69. Okay,
I read that.
I'll just be
I'm sorry,
honest.
I was laughing at that because that was something we were talking about earlier, where it's like the preterists, they're like very canon only people, but it's like they got their 66 canon and Josephus,
Right.
they slide them right up there as the 67th book. And of course, you say here is Tacitus and Eusebius.
Yeah, because they always refer to them, and Eusebius is the first one I can find who actually uses Josephus. But why is that? He's a Roman theologian who has access to the Roman libraries, so maybe that's why he uses them, right? But one should question the books of Josephus. This is my second point. We should question the books of Josephus, Taccius, and Eusebius. One is a Jewish historian pleasing Rome. And if you study the history of Josephus, he's not impressive. He's really trying to survive. Okay. Second, Taccius is a pagan pleasing Rome. Okay. And then Eusebius is politically motivated to turn the church to embracing Rome. Okay. So that should send up a lot of red flags. The empire that was slaughtering the Christians is now its friend. And the literature that comes out is Eusebius using Josephus and Taccius to connect more to Matthew 24, and he's actually kind of the great grandfather of modern 70 AD preterism. Huh. Interesting.
Right now,
isn't it?
One thing I've pointed out since the beginning is that Josephus obviously is taken on the name of the Flavians, and he's adopted into the family, and it's super shady that he's a general over there in Galilee, and he's like the only guy to emerge from the cave, and all his soldiers are dead, and then he's buddies with with the Flavians, and he's there to watch Jerusalem get destroyed. And it's also needs to be pointed out too that the Jews despise Josephus to this day. I mean, they see him as like the biggest traitor ever. All that to being said, now this is all fascinating, and I just want to point out for clarification reasons for
Yeah,
everyone listening that James and I are having a discussion right now, and he's bringing up some amazing points. But I am not like throwing out 70 AD like it never happened
sure.
or anything like that. I'm just, but I think that this conversation that we're having is needs to be had, and it's a fascinating one.
Yeah,
So
and
continue.
yeah, and I'm also saying that it didn't happen. Okay, I'm just saying there doesn't seem to be the same kind of this means that about it. Okay, but the last point here, additionally, I want to make this point. Additionally, the manuscripts we have of them do not go back to being close to when they were claimed to be written. Questioning them should be highly recommended. Let me say why that matters. When you use Josephus and say, look at this miraculous sign that took place, you see, he wrote it. You're putting the claim on Josephus, and Josephus is not authorized by God to that you shouldn't put his writings on the same level as when you read the Torah and they say, and God divided the Red Sea, and that miracle happened. I believe what Moses wrote. I should question what Josephus wrote. And most people who are in preterism 70 AD, they point to all the miraculous things that Josephus wrote about, but I don't hear anyone saying, but should we believe him? Should we just accept what he says, or even Tackius? There are some crossovers there, but when you have Eusebius come in and use it, is he using it appropriately? These are questions that we should ask, because there's a lot when I hear a predator, and I was one of them. I was putting a lot of my faith and trust in what Josephus wrote, and I'm guilty of this. I was making Josephus part of the canon of Scripture, and I don't think, and I'm not saying those miracles didn't happen because he wrote them. I'm just saying I think it's reasonable to question it and not just say it's absolute truth. That's what I'm saying. As I'm on this journey of trying to figure this out here. But and then here's the last slide too, and this is kind of where I come to a conclusion for now, is that it is clear that amillennialism and preterism are designed to cause misdirection. Now I haven't gotten all this work out, but I can see this. Don't focus on Rome, focus on the Jews, or Rome is a beast that can be tamed. Let's not kill the beast. Instead, with the reign of Christ, let's take it over. Well, that sounds like a lot of Christians today with how they're seeing America. Okay, that's a byproduct of your eschatology. And here's the thing: to the MLK followers, that combine Josephus 70 A.D. Parism with Rome and the 36 A.D. Cataclysm. This is a good question. Explain how Josephus and Tackius were able to write their histories instead of running for their lives where the world was being destroyed. Because if you look at the Cataclysm,
Yeah,
I don't understand how they were
I
able to write all these things.
I pointed this out many times that if somebody is saying that like because okay, you and I are on the same page at least about 500 AD, right? That I believe that the
Yeah,
world continued on, that
right.
the ushering in of the millennial kingdom was 500 years later. And people are
Yeah,
like, no, it happened in 78 or 72 or whatever AD. No, that's when it happened. And it's like, okay, but and then I watched some quote from Josephus. I'm like, okay, where does he even come into this? Because he wrote that after 72 AD, and he's clearly not one of the MK saints. He's clearly not
yeah,
on board. So they can never really make sense of that. Like you can't, you cannot use these guys as evidence at all if you believe that the millennial kingdom was ushered in physically upon the earth in 70 AD. You can't use these guys at all. They had to have been written like afterwards, after the kingdom. So
yeah. Well, and the thing is, what I think is happening here, and this is why I'm on this journey, and people have issue with what I'm saying. Understand, I'm trying to work this out. Knowing my background, where I came from, it's not clear to me. But what I do understand, and you talk about this on over the years, when you talk to a Protestant, they're all saying, well, you don't need to obey God because that's work salvation or whatever, right? And it's like, well, where did you get that from? Well, that's how they define faith. They have what I would say a Gnostic view of faith that separates from the body. They don't see how trusting God correlates to your life. So they think that you can just intellectually know things and you're good with the Lord, instead of actually living for him is actually a true faith, right? So when you have the wrong definitions and the wrong theology, when you go to the Bible or the text that you're reading, you have these lenses over your eyes and you're not able to read it correctly, and you don't understand what's going on. And I know something's wrong with my research here with the 70 AD things, because things aren't making sense. They're not. There's not a. If this is really true, then why am I not seeing this? And this that I'm expecting to see isn't really pointed out until like the 1800s. So why is it that they didn't see that? Why didn't Eusebius say, "Oh, and Jesus came on the clouds too"? Just thought you should know it. He doesn't say that. He just says that there was like a angels in the air and stuff like that. Well, that happens in Second Maccabees also. There's an angelic army scene in Second Maccabees. So that is not the first time. And so I don't know. I scratch my head here because it's like, well, so what's going on? I mean, we talked about the weeks of Enoch. The destruction of the temple comes after the Messiah going into heaven. So we know that it happens between Messiah going into heaven and then the destruction of Rome. We know because the apostasy comes after the temple being destroyed, but there's something odd about what's going on here. And so, I don't have the full answers, but I wanted to point it out. There's obviously a bias to Rome. There's obviously a kicking out of Chiliasm. And I think Chiliasm needs to be reevaluated because the time period we're in my opinion, is best explained through the early church's lens of eschatology and not with modern eschatology. And to people who are full preterists, who say that Satan's already been defeated and all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, please explain the time period we're in right now, because never has there been deception on this scale. It doesn't make any sense.
That's absolutely insane. That like the just the level of deception is through the roof right now. This was a super enjoyable conversation, James. I really enjoyed this. I'm very glad I brought you on. I hope that I hope people out there, you do share this with people. I think that this was I think it was a pretty groundbreaking conversation. And again, I'm just, say whatever decision James comes to, and I'm just letting everyone out there know that I'm not throwing out Josephus or Eusebius, their testimonies, or 70 AD or all that kind of stuff. But I am in agreement fully that 500 AD is where it's at on the calendar. And I keep hammering in this over and over and over again, because it's just, guys, it's like here at Tuck, we look at all these different texts. And one of the things I get from a lot of people is like, no, this is so great. You look at different texts. But then when it comes to this kind of stuff, it's like, no, I don't want to. Yeah. Forget all those extra texts, because we're going with 70 AD was the end of the world. That, that's when the kingdom was ushered in, all this kind of stuff. A part of me is thinking that's kind of messed up. That's kind of messed up that Messiah, he dies for the sins of the world in 30 AD and he resurrects, and the world has 40 years to hear this, and they're all just killed off. They're just, it's done. It's, and it's like, no, you've got this growth happening. You got the kingdom breaking out, expanding into all the world for, several hundred years before it finally gets ushered in. So I'm gonna end it here, James, unless you have anything else you want to throw in.
No, I just want to reaffirm also that I'm not saying also to throw out Josephus and Tachys and Eusebius. I'm just saying let's question them a little bit more and not just assume things. Let's do some investigation here. So I'm on that journey. I haven't made my mind up fully, but we'll see where I'm at in 2 or 3 months.
One of the things, James, is that, because I've been doing this for several years now, and I've learned the pitfalls of being on YouTube. And so what happens is that people will show up and they have this, they just want to hear this one thing, being stated. And if it doesn't sound the way they want it to sound, they'll pick out like a keyword and they'll throw it back at you, like, whatever. So I try to kind of stop a lot and say, okay, let's kind of explain this a little bit more. yeah. So anyways, yeah, that was all. I'll have to have you back on again, James. Don't be a stranger here. We'll have this because we're not going to cover this tonight, but we were talking on the phone about Islam and where that comes into it. The mystery of the 500s, some really fascinating stuff. So anyways, thank you, James, for coming on. And I've got a couple more weeks, everyone, in Italy, and then I may come to you guys from France or Spain, not really sure. And then it's been several months I've been overseas. I'm looking forward to getting back to the States again. Tomorrow, if you're watching me live, I am starting the Torah portions again. So looking forward to going through that again with you guys. Another year of Torah portions. And good night, everybody.
Right.